Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. We'd like to try to start on time. My name is Marwan Crady. I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication, which is hosting the event, which is co-sponsored with our friends in Africana Studies at Penn. I want to welcome you. It's truly a distinct pleasure for CARG to welcome Gaye and Alex for this talk about their edited collection, Futures of Black Radicalism. But before I introduce the book and the speakers, since we're so lucky to have many people who are not usually part of our audience today, let me speak a bit about CARG. The Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the Annenberg School produces and promotes scholarly research on global communication and public life. We are an institute for advanced study dedicated to global media studies, and we revisit enduring questions and engage with pressing matters in geopolitics, politics, and communication. Our vision is one of inclusive globalization that recognizes both plurality and inequality in the world. Our translocal approach fuses multidisciplinary regional knowledge with theory and methodology in general, and we believe that this synthesis of deep expertise and interdisciplinary inquiry stimulates critical conversations about what we'd like to call entrenched and emerging structures, practices, flows, and struggles. Including the 2 years when the center was a project, we were born in 2013 with impetus and support from Dean Michael Deli Carpini, who just joined us. So this is CARG's 5th year that we're sort of working through as the official inaugural year. So please tweet up a storm. We are at Annenberg CARG, and we have a special hashtag for the year, which is CARG1718. That's the only reason you should be playing with your cell phones during this talk. With racial justice struggles on the rise, this is a probing collection that considers the past and the future of black radicalism. Black rebellion has returned, as the book jacket announces. Dramatic protests have risen up in scores of cities and campuses. There's a renewed engagement with the history of black radical movements and thoughts. Here, we have a group of key intellectuals that were gathered by Gaye and Alex to celebrate and study the work, the seminal work of the activist and scholar Cedric Robinson. And it recalls the powerful tradition of black radicalism while defining new directions for activists and thinkers alike. Reading the book's jacket demonstrate why this is at the heart of the mission of CARG. Some of you may have a question. The question, what does black radicalism and Cedric Robinson have to do with the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication? Here's your answer. This is from the book's jacket. In a time when activists in Ferguson, Palestine, Baltimore, and Hong Kong immediately connect across vast distances, this book makes clear that the new black radical politics is thoroughly internationalist and redraws the links between black resistance and anti-capitalism. Featuring these key voices in this new intellectual wave, this collection outlines one of the most vibrant areas of thought today. So let me speak very briefly about our speakers. First, we have Gaye Theresa Johnson, who's a professor of African American Studies and Chicana and Chicano Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles. She writes and teaches about race and racism, cultural politics, and freedom struggles. Her first book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles, was published with the University of California Press in 2013, and is a history of civil rights and spatial struggles among black and brown freedom seekers in LA since the 40s. She is completing a book under contract with the University of North Carolina Press titled Let's Get Free, Artists and Activism in the 21st Century. Johnson is also president of CAUSE, which is the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. Our second speaker is Alex Lubin, who's a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. Alex also is associate provost, but he didn't include it in his bio. Alex was also director of the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Beirut for a number of years. His scholarship engages global history of race, the African diaspora, and transnational American studies of North Africa and the Middle East. He is the author of Geographies of Liberation, The Making of an Afro-Arab Political Imaginary, also with the University of North Carolina Press, 2014, and Romance and Rights, The Politics of Interracial Intimacy, 1945 to 1954. He is the editor of Revising the Blueprint, Ann Petrie and the Literary Left, Settler Colonialism, a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly, A number of other books, including American Studies Encounters the Middle East, which I had the pleasure of co-editing with Alex, and of course, Futures of Black Radicalism. I want to thank again the Center for Africana Studies at Penn for co-sponsoring this CARG book talk. I want to thank Marina for all the logistics. I want to thank Phil and Waldo for helping us immortalize the moment, so to speak, and the Penn Book Center, who will have books for sale at the end of the talk. I also want to thank you all for coming. I'm very thrilled that in addition to Annenberg, Africana Studies, the Graduate School of Education, the Departments of Sociology, Anthropology, and the Wharton School at Penn, who are all represented here, we have people in attendance from Temple, from Drexel, from Swarthmore, and from Philadelphia Media. Welcome to you all. Alex and Gaye, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so great to be here, and we so appreciate the invitation. We want to thank the organizers of the event. Are these on too? Can I? So I don't. What do you? Oh, he's not there anymore. How much you move around? Oh yeah, I won't move too much. Okay. But especially, we want to thank Marwan and Marina. And also all of you for being here today. I'm going to talk about how our book, Futures of Black Radicalism, which I noticed when I looked in the mirror, I actually matched the book today. I didn't do that on purpose. See? But I'm going to talk about how our book came into being and also what we intend for the work in this historical moment. Many scholars of Black resistance, of revolution more broadly, of anti-colonialism and Marxism, of political economy and racial capitalism, of prison abolition and Black film, sound their ruminations in the echoes of Cedric Robinson's influence. Yet a lot of times people aren't completely aware of the reach and influence and value of his scholarship, even as they write and act in that echo, because his work was obscure in many ways for so long, for a number of reasons. Partly it was that Robinson's scholarship never really flowed inside a tributary of ambition or felt entitlement to academic stardom. But some of the most generative scholarship on contemporary capitalism and rebellion has resulted from studying what Cedric famously described as the Black radical tradition, which, as we recount in our introduction, is a tradition of resistance that's honed by the history of racialized, permanent, hereditary, and chattel slavery that formed the contours of civic and social life in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. In Black Marxism, Robinson demonstrated the limitations of Enlightenment philosophy to adequately explain the force of racial regimes, going even further to locate Black radicalism outside of a Eurocentric core. And this is something Alex will take up more fully in his remarks. But let me just say that we believe that another reason that his work has only relatively recently become more mainstream is that Robinson's early scholarship in the terms of order in Black Marxism and in the anthropology of Marxism so fundamentally challenged the assumptions of liberal and Marxist theories of revolution that many scholars writing within capitalism, even the most radical among us, could not imagine the start of the project of Black liberation before capitalism's development. Yet Robinson's work, including his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Blacks and the Regimes of Race in American Theater and Film Before World War II, is some of the most significant of its kind on Black political economy, culture, and dialectical thinking. And the essays written by the contributors to Futures of Black Radicalism bear this out in important ways. Our authors range from the famous and most respected in their fields to a newer generation of scholars whose optic is rooted squarely in 21st century experiences. And this is one reason why we wrote this book, to acknowledge this pervasive and largely unacknowledged influence that Robinson's work has on so many scholars. But it was also a recognition of the present moment and the continued significance of studying the Black radical tradition that inspired us, recognizing that many insurgent Black movements struggling against surveillance and carceral regimes explicitly call out racial capitalism as the source of the terrible oppression that is growing even more terrible by the day in many instances in both national and international scope. and recognizing the enduring significance of the Black radical tradition. We hope this book can act as an intervention, as a reminder of the specific inheritances of struggle that we believe the futures of Black radicalism depend on. In hindsight, it was probably a little bit of a challenge for our contributors to be tasked with drawing from a tradition that Robinson argues predates capitalism to offer commentary on the future of Black radicalism. But it was one that they were up for, as you'll see in the book, and this agility is most felt in Helen Kwan's essay on time travel, in Shauna Redman and Kwame Phillips' The People Who Keep On Going, in Greg Burris's Birth of a Zionist Nation on Film and the Future of Palestine, and in Robin Kelley's Afterword, where he writes, futures of self-determined collective democracy find ashes in 17th century Marronage, in 19th century camp revivals, in anti-colonial millenarian uprisings. W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James turned to slave rebellions in order to chart a future beyond fascism. Amilcar Cabral, one of Robinson's favorite subjects, understood that a radical future for Africa required that we return to the source. So in that sense, this book is much more than a tribute or hagiography. It is, as we write, intended to draw us into closer proximity, not to the description, nor the illusion, for that matter, of freedom struggles, but closer to the spirit of abolition, the work of revolutionary change, the relentless critique of oppression by all of those engaged in that work. And even as we mean to archive a moment in Black radical intellectual thought rather than to define one, we also attribute the incitement for these essays to the brilliant inventiveness practiced by radical social actors, by freedom seekers and freedom dreamers across the diaspora. As the idea for this edited volume came to fruition, it was Cedric Robinson himself, with Elizabeth Robinson's insights, who devised the list of scholars that would eventually become the incredible roster of contributors to this book, all of them writing in critical engagement with the Black radical tradition. The underlying assumption is that studying this tradition holds renewed significance for struggle in the 21st century. So the question is, what are these futures of Black radicalism? In fact, these days I know we're asking ourselves daily, what is this present that we find ourselves in? Because sometimes, I know for me, I think we speak for probably what has become a wearisome, for all of you as well, what has become a wearisome pattern in which we're continually asked to justify our humanity to people who will never recognize it and whose principal undertaking has been to destroy it. And I think, like everyone in this room, we feel both the weight and the possibility of this political moment. And we all know all too well this feeling, which has sometimes been like an avalanche of assaults that have been visited on our communities with renewed and more sophisticated force by the present administration and its beneficiaries. And I want to note just briefly here that for many of us who are charged with studying and teaching about these assaults in specific detail, or for those of us who organize, and even more for those of us who are directly affected by these insults, in such a way as to add them to the increasing difficulty of working under these conditions, this can create a kind of ongoing trauma and fatigue. It's just kind of real talk here about what it means to teach in this moment, what it means to discuss these things in this moment. And you all know what I mean. I don't even have to really explain it. I'm jointly appointed in Chicano Studies and African American Studies at UCLA, and I teach students who are directly affected by the culmination of right-wing conservatism over the past 50 years, especially those suffering under the rescindment of DACA, the end of other immigrant protections such as the temporary protected status for Salvadorans. And it all feels very sudden to my undergraduates who are directly affected, which adds to the trauma. But many of us know that the pernicious, intense, and specific harms of white supremacy, as we speak about in our introduction, have designs and delegations that began long before the 2016 election. They've just found more of a home in this moment, in the embrace of racist expression, all in the name of national security. And we know that the people responsible for those forces have been organizing for and awaiting this moment for some time. And so when we zoom out to see it in that way, we understand something a little different about the landscape, which can usurp a bit of power away from the facade. Robinson most helpfully instructs us that racist regimes possess history, but racial regimes are unrelentingly hostile to their exhibition. And why is this? This antipathy exists, he says, because a discoverable history is incompatible with a racial regime. And from that realization that paradoxically, so are its social relations. As he explains, race presents all the appearance of stability. And that's what's happening now. Certainly not the mental or emotional stability of people in power enacting white supremacy, but the stability of the history of whiteness and white people, and more conveniently imagine the history of blackness and black people. But Robinson goes on to say, history, however, compromises this fixity. Race is mercurial, deadly, and slick. And since race is presumably natural, the intrusion of convention shatters race's relationship to the natural world. What Robinson is saying, and what we build on in this volume, is that racial regimes are constructed social systems in which race is proposed as a justification for the relations of power. They are articulated with the accruals of power. We see this now in so many ways, but the covering conceit of a racial regime is, as Robinson says, a makeshift patchwork, masquerading as memory and the immutable, masquerading as memory. And this is at the heart of the invention of the Negro, he says, of representational histories and of racial relations. Social relations undermine racial regimes, discoverable history threatens their authority. And this is why film, cultural politics, and production were so important to Cedric, because not only do they incite and animate, much more than represent traditions of resistance, they uncover and they expose. It's why history is so important, especially when talking about futures of Black radicalism. Now, this is a valuable piece of information, and it's something that I try to use and in fact, really try to break down for my undergraduates, even freshmen, to talk to them about remembering not to naturalize or rationalize the ways that people are oppressed as something that's a result of human nature or a natural evolution of the economy. It's important, and it makes for a powerful pedagogical point and method. But we have to do more than that, I think. And I'm finding that when I only focus there, and when I try to simply best the other side with sharper arguments or with a better point, that I actually just miss the point. And if I may say, just with the utmost respect and kindness to all of us in this profession, who continue to merely point out the atrocities and try to out-argue the ignorant without reminding us of who we are. Well, it's not all of what we need today. To be perfectly honest with you about where I think we are, all it does, at least for me, is make you battle-worn by too much knowledge, too much intellectualizing, not enough recognition of the importance of the struggle for what it is. Sometimes beautiful, often bitter, hopefully mostly beloved. But there are these terrible realities we have to reckon with, and they require a precision, of course, with which we have to hone our understanding so we contribute to a general elevation of conversation around these issues. But we can't have those conversations in meaningful ways if we're emotionally and intellectually diminished by the ongoing trauma of these assaults and insults and injuries, so much so that we forget what is the most foundational and most important truth of all, that there is beauty in this Black radical struggle, that it is precious, and that we are created and we create the ability to receive the bounty of what we've earned just by being human beings. In an age when we are constantly inundated with things we shouldn't believe, we hope that this book is helpful for thinking about some things we know we can believe in, that we know are tried and true in our communities, and that the Black radical tradition continues to enliven. We can believe in our community's abilities to work collectively to change the relationships of power that affect us. We can believe that it's possible to eliminate the multiple forms of violence used against and within our communities. We can believe in a shared future whose principal promise is the abolition of all forms of oppression. To remind ourselves of what we can believe in is to understand who we really are together. It's to inspire a greater consciousness of these specific inheritances that I mentioned are part of our radical traditions. We can believe in ongoing struggle even if we don't always agree, from the roots of radical thought to a shared understanding and collective witness of the present political moment. Elizabeth Robinson, Cedric Robinson's wife of over 50 years, wrote the preface after Cedric died. And maybe if you don't know, this is also sort of a deeply personal book for both of us, because we're both incredibly influenced by Cedric Robinson. He was my colleague at UC Santa Barbara for several years. He was also someone that I'd known since I was a child, actually, because I grew up kind of in the shadow of the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he taught for so long. And so it's kind of with a particular poignancy that we read the essays that were offered here to this volume, and especially the preface, because we talked to Cedric and Elizabeth together about this volume as it started to come into form, and they were the ones that selected these contributors, but also we lost Cedric before its publication. And Elizabeth then had to go on to write the preface that they had agreed to do together. And so she engages in this remarkable style of dialogue, responding and adding to a speech of Cedric's from I think it was 2013, that was transcribed for the Endeavor. And he talks about one of the weaknesses of Black radicalism as an ideology, that it does not inherently or automatically create a future in which justice is certain. As Cedric opines, unlike in Marxism, where the proletariat inevitably win, or in Black Christianity, where Black people inevitably dwell in a utopic future, Black radicalism provides us merely with the promise of future liberation. He argued, only when that radicalism is costumed or achieves an envelope in Black Christianity is there a certainty to it. Otherwise, it's about a kind of resistance that does not promise triumph or victory at the end, only liberation. No nice package at the end, only that you would be free. It comes out of the insult to African identities that slavery represents. It was unacceptable. It was unacceptable, he says. And as Elizabeth Robinson then responds, she says, if we are to move the Black radical tradition forward, it is imperative that we understand that it is not utopian. Rather, it is about questing for freedom. It is about the necessity of recognizing the importance of struggle regardless of outcomes. Nor does it begin and end intellectually. We must look beyond the straitjackets of race to understand common histories in order to make common cause. So only the promise of liberation. The futures of Black radicalism, therefore, are not a destination, but a recognition of the value of struggle. I was thinking last night, I haven't seen the movie yet, but I've been wondering if maybe our discomfort with the absence of utopia explains why Wakanda brings such widespread joy. And I don't know, I haven't seen it yet. I think you've seen it though, right, Alex? And if there was a place where true freedom and justice for Black people is more than viable, it gives Black radicalism more than a promise, but the actual contours, the taste and the texture of a freedom that was always on the horizon, even if living in what will one day be past, knowing that because we have imagined it, it is possible. I mean, this is like one of those basic freedoms that Black people have not been able to enjoy. You know, when someone tries to leverage our own humanity against us, it can feel so violent as to be almost permanent, but it's not. Let's take Trump's examples or comments about Haiti, for example. And I say this kind of as a way to wrap up here. But I was asked to do this, like many of us are asked to do, the keynote for Martin Luther King Day celebration recently. And I was struggling this time. I mean, you know, many of us, we've done a lot of these talks, and you know, but I was struggling with this one because it was like the week after he had said what he did about Haiti. And I knew that people were coming into this space. There were tons of folks, right? I knew people were coming into this space really just feeling so heavy and, so insulted and so hurt, but also worried. Because this is like one of those, this is like in Ventura County. And so it's in a place where there's like a lot of Black folks like over the age of 65, 70, my parents aged like 70, in their 70s, who were really, demoralized by the moment. Not to mention all of us who are in many generations, looking mutually at each other, feeling this way. And I really struggled with writing this. And then I thought about the Haitian Revolution. Thankfully, blessedly, because it came to me just like hours before I had to give the talk. And I was thinking, this is the point, is that we already have these stories in our communities, that we don't need a prescription about where to go because we've already done this before. This is why it's so important to study the Black radical tradition, because all of the answers are already here. And so here I'm merely paraphrasing because I think Cedric renders one of the most engaging and effective stories of the Haitian Revolution. So again, I'm merely just paraphrasing here. The largest and most successful slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere commenced in 1791. And by 1804, the Black people of Haiti had done what no other nation on earth had achieved: abolished slavery, won independence, and set an example that would inspire slave rebellion throughout the New World. Now he talks about, over the course of many pages in his book on Black social movements, how by 1804, in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and countless Black women participated in slave rebellions. And that in the wake of Nat Turner's revolt, Virginians, as he says, were seized with panic. Hundreds fled the county, and many left the state for good. And this was the last straw. And he says that from 1831 onward, no slave owner lived comfortably with slavery now that they understood the anger, the resistance, the vengeance that boiled beneath the institution. C.L.R. James records how in the wake of the slaves' victory, the British opted to abolish the slave trade for fear of importing resistive African labor to their colonies. The French abandoned their pretension to empire when they sold off their possessions in America with the Louisiana Purchase. Haiti itself became a signal of anti-colonial revolution, and it had so much power that when the revolutionary leader Simón Bolívar asked for their support in the independence wars to liberate Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, and Peru from Spain, Haiti agreed only on the condition that Bolívar would free the continent's slaves. And later, as we get closer to the Civil War in the United States, remembering that with the memory of the Haitian Revolution, but also of the many struggles and losses and terrible tragedies that came between the Haitian Revolution and the magical 1865 number that's constantly paraded in front of our faces as historians, that slaves had rebelled in an additional 25 conspiracies in Arkansas, Virginia, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Kentucky. And in fact, by 1862, escaped slaves in the lower and upper South made for the nearest Union forces. For example, Robinson shows that of the 112,000 slaves in Missouri, 22,000 had escaped by 1862. Now, of course, we know there's a lot of history in between there. Again, a lot of losses, a lot of triumph, and a terrible amount of tragedy, especially after 1865. After 1865, well into the 20th century, into the 21st century. But when we imagine that someone with no qualifications for his position, really, other than money and white entitlement, an atrocious track record of housing and employment discrimination, recorded evidence of collusion and sexual harassment, and no class, disparages this mighty nation of Haiti, its legacy and its descendants. And we juxtapose that utterance against this brilliant history, against this Black radical tradition that was imbued in Haiti, but also which had a kind of diasporic ripple. There's really no contest here. And we know that the endurance of struggle in the Black radical tradition has done more than bolster the courage of Afro-diasporic people. We know that it has commissioned imaginaries and generated epistemologies that have shaped radical intellectual traditions across the world. So the real question is then, and this was the question for me, I didn't ask this question in that talk, but the real question for me is how do we muster what we know already, what we already possess in our communities? How can the Black radical tradition serve to encourage us to return to this knowledge when we really have no time to rest and recalibrate between these assaults? And this is a question that's reckoned with on a daily basis in places under regimes of violence. And we're under a regime of violence here as well, in a different kind of way than in some other places. But the only way to meet that challenge is to believe that the traditions we've created and the traditions of radicalism can sustain among us, and to know that it's not only enough, but stronger than the forces that oppose it. So how can white supremacy, which these days feels like it's stronger than ever, if we consider that history, if we consider what we already have, how can that be stronger than our historic fights for survival, than the miracle of Black and brown survival in the US? How could it be stronger than that, which is unaccountable by normal circumstances? And to add to that, the miracle of visions of humanity and democracy that we have imagined and enacted, that we have imagined and enacted not just as social actors, but also in fields of discipline that make Black studies, Chicano studies, Middle Eastern studies, Asian American studies, gender studies, more than just add-ons to sociology, the history of what we already know. And I think this is rather the point of this book, to animate a tradition that gives us a place to build, not just a place to tear down. And if we think of this moment in this way, and we shift our language to recall the magnificence of our own struggles, the bitterness also of our own struggles, and to remember, as Elizabeth Robinson and Cedric Robinson urge us to in the preface, to recall the courage in our hearts. We're reminded that maybe what appears to be the strength of white supremacy and the dominance of the US in the global market is actually the fragility and the fissure in their constructions. And the most important lie of this regime is the appearance of its fixity and strength. But we've always been particularly good at diagnosing this as a historical facade, as a racial regime, as a covering conceit. And the protests that we now see stand on the shoulders of Black and brown protests. They follow on the heels of a tradition both intended and compelled to endure. So with this book, we just want to remind all of us of what we already have, of its value, and why it is more vital than ever that we revisit and maintain the principles also of nonviolence, which is very hard right now. Very, 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 very hard. Because we feel a kind of violent anger against those who continue to hurt us and our children, to say they want to send us a box of food instead of food stamps. There's a reason why you can't buy liquor with food stamps, because it's meant for children. And so when they come in and they try to hurt our children, this is when we feel, I do as a mother, feel a violence. But it's more vital than ever that we maintain the principles of nonviolence, because those who want to discriminate against children in DACA, in TPS, in the prison industrial complex, those people aren't our people. And what we want to build doesn't come from a foundation of ignorance and hate and violence. What we believe in is something different. As the authors of Critical Freedom Dreams and Complex Sonic and Spatial Politics, freedom seekers in this historical record remind us that we don't struggle to create meaningful futures out of nothing. The historical groundwork has been laid already over decades of shared alliances, identities, and identifications. And if I just might return to something I said at the beginning, and that we end the book with, it is our hope that this book will inspire a greater consciousness of the specific inheritances of the Black radical tradition. We believe in freedom, unqualified liberation, abolition, and nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, can you hear me? So one of the great pleasures of being an academic, particularly after the point when you get tenure, is you get to collaborate with brilliant and smart friends And so I've had the pleasure of doing that both with my friend Marwan Kraidi, who I thank for inviting us to this talk today, as well as to my colleague and friend Gaye Johnson. I also want to thank Marina for organizing all the details, and the Africana Studies Center, and everyone else who co-sponsored our visit. I'm going to be somewhat brief and sort of talk about a couple aspects of the book and Cedric Robinson's work that I think is especially important at this time. 1 year into the tumultuous Trump administration, scholars continue to diagnose the racial politics of Trumpism. On the one hand, it seems that white supremacy has been given national sanction by the President of the United States. White supremacists have marched with lit torches in Charlottesville, Virginia. Klansmen like David Duke feel newly emboldened. Alt-right fascist groups have reared their heads at US institutions of higher education. Make America Great Again seems to be a call for white racial nationalism and not merely a nostalgic invocation of an America that never was. But it's not just the president's speech nor the newfound publicity of the so-called alt-right that is most disconcerting. This administration is rolling back long-established civil rights gains in voting rights and LGBTQ rights, gutting environmental protections that impact the poor and people of color, scaling back social welfare programs like Medicaid, easing restrictions on and accountability for police, funneling resources into private prisons, and reinstituting some of the most heinous legacies of the war on drugs. At the same time, the Trump Justice Department is targeting Black protest by labeling Black Lives Matter protesters Black identity extremists, subject to counter-terrorist policing. A move similar, by the way, to the Obama Justice Department's placing of Assata Shakur, the former Black Panther Party member, on the nation's most wanted terrorist list in 2003, excuse me. The administration's invocation of white supremacy, of course, has a history. Indeed, Trumpism is a nostalgic call for the nation to return to its white settler nationalist roots. But what strikes us as particularly jarring in the present political moment is the ferocity of white supremacy following the 8-year administration of the first Black president of the United States, and at a time when Black protest, which is always present, has emerged among a new generation of intersectional millennial activists. It would be tempting to view this moment as one characterized only by this ascendant white supremacy, new anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness, given new strength and legitimacy by the executive branch of the US government. But to do so, and to view this moment only in this way, is to ignore, as Gaye said, how the seeming strength and vitality of white supremacy and toxic masculinity may in fact be indications of their fragility and tenuousness. Indeed, while the forces of white supremacy have waited a long time for a president like Donald J. Trump, the newfound power of white supremacist organizations is actually rooted in their fragility. Race, of course, is an ideology that requires constant reformulation to endure. As scholars ranging from Stuart Hall to Barbara J. Fields and, of course, Cedric J. Robinson and many others have shown, the way that race gets reformulated is through memory and meaning-making in culture. Hence, to understand the power of race in the age of Trump, one needs to consider what Cedric Robinson refers to as the forgeries of memory and meaning that constitute dominant racial formations. Viewing race as based in contests over memory and forgeries of the past helps clarify why fierce moments of racial terror often occur during moments of radical social transformation and challenges from below. The racism is dialectically related to its opposite, to that which struggles in opposition. The task, then, is to identify opposition amidst violence, freedom amidst injustice. It was one of Robinson's many contributions to understanding the force of white supremacy as a forgery of history and memory, a covering conceit he identified as rooted in racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is an unstable formation, one that requires continual cultural and political work to shore up its insecurities. Hence, Robinson studied race as an ideological formation of capitalism that was constantly in crisis and in need of redefinition. This explains why he saw the most vociferous moments of racial supremacy not merely as dangerous examples of dominant power, which to be clear, it certainly is, sometimes referring to what he called the ontological totality of racial capitalism. But also, these moments were filled with transformative potential, with everyday acts of joy, love, and life constituting the basis for radical longings and interventions. Because Robinson understood racial capitalism as dominant but always unstable, he understood each historical epoch as ripe for radicalism. And because the axis of racial capitalism, he argued, centered on Black subjugation as well as colonization of indigenous bodies, Robinson was interested in understanding Black radicalism as subjugated knowledge refusing to engage dominant norms. He demonstrated that the dream of liberation on the part of Black radical artists, thinkers, and activists took place within violent conditions of racial capitalism, but quite apart from its rules and mandates. Hence, Robinson studied what he identified as the Black radical tradition as the accumulated wisdom of freedom strivers, ancestors, and Black radical thinkers who refused to follow along and who rejected rules that were not of their making and that didn't account for their humanity. Robinson identified the political in a radical tradition constantly expressing itself in everyday life, in small acts of joy, survival, and refusal, and not just in the sanctioned domains of politics and governance. As an aside, Robinson has much to offer to the political theory of what Joan Scott refers to as, quote, forms of insubordination that might suitably be called the infrapolitics of the powerless. Robinson was interested in a form of Black radical thinking rooted in acts of what he called political refusal, exile, and escape. As he and Elizabeth Robinson articulate in the preface to Futures of Black Radicalism, Robinson was interested in the politics of maroonage, in the politics of everyday Black radical thinkers who refuse to be governed, as H.L.T. Kwan writes in her contribution to our book. Hence, Robinson's scholarship focused on the Black radical imaginary, which he identified in those who challenge religious, economic, cultural, and political authority. A representative figure of this tradition were the enslaved humans who fled to make a new world, such as the former Black captives who removed themselves to the Great Dismal Swamp, traversing Virginia and North Carolina, where they reconstituted the world outside of a modernity that denied their humanity. According to Robinson, the political theory that emerged from places like the Great Dismal Swamp could not fully be understood through the rubrics of Marxism. Something more than proletarian rebellion was at play in the Great Dismal Swamp. And moreover, chattel slavery seemed to undermine Marx's insistence that capitalism had replaced feudalism. The enslaved were, as Julia Ott has argued, the capital of capitalism. And hence, rather than viewing capitalism as an evolution from feudalism, Robinson viewed slavery, its feudal relations in which the enslaved worked without a wage, as part of racial capitalism. Further, Robinson sought to identify an organically Black radical politics or political philosophy that he coined Black Marxism, a radical anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist Black philosophy rooted to an understanding of racial capitalism, but not bound to the notion of the proletariat as the sole revolutionary force. Although he was engaged with Marxist thought, Robinson's project ultimately critiqued its elision of Black radical philosophy, and further argued that Marxism was incapable of comprehending the desires and political imaginaries of the Black masses. What was most useful in Marxism, he argued, was its emphasis on dialectical thought. But on the whole, he argued, that Black radicalism has had to contend not only with the totality of domination under racial capitalism, but also with the limitations of Enlightenment philosophy to adequately explain the force of racial regimes. As he wrote in the preface to the 2000 edition of Black Marxism, although Marxism had seemed for a time to be a useful theory for Black liberation, ultimately, quote, Marxism's internationalism was not global. Its materialism was exposed as an insufficient explanator of cultural and social forces, and its economic determinism too often politically compromised freedom struggles beyond or outside the metropole. For Black radicals, historically and immediately linked to social bases predominantly made of peasants and farmers in the West Indies, or sharecroppers and peons in North Africa, or forced laborers on colonial plantations in Africa, Marxism appeared distracted from the cruelest and most characteristic manifestations of the world economy. This exposed the inadequacies of Marxism as an apprehension of the modern world, but equally troubling, and I think this is really Cedric's seminal contribution here, was Marxism's neglect and miscomprehension of the nature and genesis of liberation struggles which already had occurred and surely had yet to appear among these people. So as Gaye was gesturing towards, there was a Black radical tradition that had formed before the development of capitalism. And so Marxism was a discourse that looked solely to the European proletariat as the progenitor of a radical politics. And Cedric argued that actually one had to look to Central and West Africa, to social movements among African, particularly women, to understand a kind of radical politics that was outside of the frameworks of proletariat politics. Hence, in Black Marxism, his sort of most famous book, Robinson focuses on Black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and C.L.R. James, who each engaged with Marxism, quote, for a time, but ultimately moved beyond or rejected it altogether because they saw the revolutionary potential of the Black masses who drew on the Black radical tradition as the basis for living and surviving. Black Marxism is often misread as an intellectual history of Black thinkers who retooled Marxism to suit their conditions. And in that way, I think the book is mistitled. And Elizabeth Robinson told me that that was not the original title that Cedric had planned for the book, that the publishers put Black Marxism there. But the book is actually a critique of Marxism's inability to account for the Black radical tradition. And Robinson himself did not self-identify as a Marxist. Robinson rejects the notion that capitalism replaced feudalism, and he argued that Marxism fails to understand or account for African resistance to slavery and exploitation. He focused attention not solely on proletarian rebellion in the West, but on West and Central African resistance prior to capitalism that is the inheritance of the Black radical tradition. Further, it is not an intellectual history, Black Marxism, in the usual way we think of this model. Rather, Robinson focuses on Du Bois, Wright, and C.L.R. James to illuminate the collectives of Black radicals who inspired them. In that way, Black Marxism is an anti-intellectual history that focuses on these individuals only insofar as doing so illuminates the needs of the many who shaped the individual. Our book, Futures of Black Radicalism, is inspired by Robinson's scholarship and political commitments. But more than just a festschrift or hagiography, the book is a sustained engagement with Robinson's work and an opportunity to extend it into the future. This is key not only because we admire Robinson's interventions, but also because for much of his life, as Gaye mentioned, Robinson's scholarship was misunderstood or more often ignored altogether. This collection is a collaborative project in the best sense of the term, intended to draw attention to Robinson, to an analysis of racial capitalism, and to the Black radical tradition. Our hope is not only that readers will engage with the excellent essays in the collection, but they will also go back and read Cedric's work and re-engage with the terms of order. These are his books, The Anthropology of Marxism, Black Movements in America, Black Marxism, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, and dozens of articles. Our edited collection is organized around three thematic frames that reflect the broad terrain of Robinson's constructions: understanding racial capitalism, the Black radical tradition, and imagining the future. We chose these frames in order to enact the kind of dialectical thought process required for these times. No movement forward can rest on a faulty foundational understanding of racial capitalism. This is why in the first section of the book, scholars engage the intersecting logics of race and capitalism as conditions that confront social movements in the United States today. Stephen Osuna and Damian Sojourner are especially interested in the formation of anti-Blackness in an era of neoliberal racial capitalism. Nikhil Paul Singh, as well as Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, examine the micropolitics of racial capitalism, as articulated in the formation of so-called primitive accumulation and in the racialized construction of things to be exchanged for value. Francois Verger explores the convergence of racial capitalism and environmental racism. The second section of the book focuses on the Black radical tradition and its capacity to not only negate the conditions of racial capitalism, but also to survive and thrive under conditions of racial terror. In this section, scholars consider the forms of dialectical thought that have informed various freedom struggles, beginning with an interview featuring Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson, and moving to a consideration of various political struggles that, in the words of one of our contributors and mentor, George Lipsitz, quote, responded consistently by forging advanced concepts of a deeply politicized love. In addition, this section engages various international struggles for Black liberation in order to stretch the horizons of the Black radical tradition beyond the United States and outside of the West. For example, Greg Burris looks at the global solidarity uniting Black protest in the United States with Palestinian protest. Paul Ortiz considers the applicability of the Black radical tradition to Latin American social movements. And Daryl Thomas recalls the internationalism of Malcolm X in order to locate Black radicalism in North Africa and the Middle East. In the final section of the book, scholars think about the future by identifying new forms of imagination and struggle through which to achieve liberation. The chapters in this section take up various aspects of abolitionist politics, from prison abolition to Black music and visual culture, that attempt to imagine new futures. Helen Kwan explores the concept of ungovernability through the figure of the fugitive and Afrofuturist. Avery Gordon analyzes the aesthetic politics of Black radicalism in 3 recently commissioned works by African-American artist Glenn Ligon, a series that he calls Call and Response. Shauna Redmond and Kwame Phillips curate a sonic mixtape of Black liberation music, which you can listen to on the Verso website. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore outlines the possibilities of abolitionism given the present conjuncture of incarceration and policing. The section ends with Angela Davis discussing the possibilities for new political imaginaries linked to the older ones. There are 2 afterwords in the book. Erica Edwards returns us to Cedric Robinson, of what she calls Cedric people, in order to demonstrate the communities of fate that sustained and enlivens Robinson's study of Black radicalism. And the book ends with Robin D.G. Kelly focusing on the ancestors who created Robinson's worlds. Edwards and Kelly's afterwards enact the Black radical tradition by excavating a history of friendships and familial relations that helped Robinson think dialectically. These pieces remind us how love and kinship, often some of the most significant forces available to us, can be transformed into powerful actions in the service of a just future. And here I'm quoting from the end of the introduction. In all of his writings on the Black radical tradition, Robinson revealed with great care the precision with which Black freedom fighters discerned the fractures in regimes of racism and state power. He archived their commensurate insurrections, seen and unseen, as evidence of an uncompromising struggle. I think Gaye read this as well. The endurance of these practices has done more than bolster the courage of Afro-diasporic people. It has commissioned imaginaries and generated epistemologies that have shaped radical intellectual traditions across the world. It is our hope that this book will inspire a greater consciousness of the specific inheritances of the Black radical tradition. The futures of Black radicalism depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaye and Alex. You take some questions from the audience, please.
Thank you guys for coming and for this presentation. I'm thinking about something and I'm just wondering how you might respond. I've been thinking about appropriation of Black radicalism by not radical forces, right? Like trying to remember that where we are comes out of the racial politics of the Obama regime also. So do you guys think about, like, is there a risk of appropriation of what you're calling Black radicalism? I mean, if Malcolm X can figure as like a figure of US empire, like how do we protect it? You know what I mean? While bringing more visibility.
Well, I'll start with what I think is kind of a pretty simple answer, which is that, because we are working within capitalism, and we saw, and I know there was quite an uproar during the Super Bowl about this. What was the Martin Luther King, the Dodge commercial. I don't think we can avoid it. I think it's, as I think you're intimating there, is that we can't really avoid that appropriation. And sometimes that appropriation occurs by the people who are supposed to be our friends and allies, and even more insidiously by them sometimes. But I think the answer to it is that we continue to do this work. I mean, there's really kind of no other way. It's that we continue to believe in it for what it is and to intend it for very specific kinds of practices of liberation. And I think also, yes, to protect it, I mean, means to be in the struggle and to understand that even those folks who intend to be the most radical and who intend for the Black radical tradition to help the people who need it the most, that even when they make mistakes, this is also part of the Black radical tradition. It's public arguments about which way we're going, and then coming to some kind of sometimes public agreement, and sometimes not. But nonetheless, a lively discourse. A lively discourse among equals is different from appropriation. But at the same time, I do think that the answer is quite simple. We have to continue to do the work.
And I would just echo that I think part of the work is also excavating the history of Black radicalism and resisting the ways that it gets commodified in culture. So in the example that Gaye just gave of MLK's speech, which, by the way, was explicitly about the capitalism of buying cars and critiquing the very subject of the ad. But that is a broader conception of how the radical MLK has been appropriated into a kind of neoliberal multiculturalist, or a pluralist, rather than someone who is actually talking about racial capitalism, or that pits Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. against each other, or that writes out the contributions of Black feminist thinkers altogether. So I think part of the struggle is also thinking historically and deeply about how not just Black culture, but radical politics gets co-opted by cultural movements. So it's not so much, I think, the issue of, I think what Robinson was writing about and what Ruthie Gilmore in our collection writes about is how the sort of abolitionist politics of Black radicalism is about liberating everyone. It's not just about freeing Black people, although that might be its primary register, but it's about an abolitionism that smashes all forms of oppression. That said, it can absolutely be the case that people misappropriate, misuse, and misdistribute sort of Black culture or Black cultural forms that may have been radical at their origin.
Thank you so much. I think this is really inspiring. So my question, I have a lot of questions, but one question is about, the sort of contemporary manifestations of Black radicalism tradition. Would you say something about, for instance, in recent movement, Black Lives Matter, what do you think are some of the manifestations of the earlier traditions of Black radicalism?
Do you want to start?
No, you go
ahead. Did everyone hear the question? Yeah. Of course, I think so many of us are so inspired by them in part because of how intersectional they are, and that in an explicit form. And I mean, this is part of the intrinsic value of Black radical tradition, that it wasn't always explicitly stated, even by the scholars who sought to document it in the richness that it deserved. It wasn't until Black feminist scholars really kind of crafted the language around intersectionality, and not just in terms of the way that we are oppressed, but also in the ways that we respond, that scholars who studied the Black radical tradition and people like Cedric himself were then moved to push his analysis a little bit further. And I think what's so amazing about this moment is that we see people explicitly deploying these, not just the language, but the method as well, in myriad ways. I mean, certainly in the strategies around movement, but also in the art and culture, and the demands that our representation have some integrity around these questions that are have so violently affected the Black community. In the introduction to our book, we quote Dana Smith, a poet who says, I can't remember precisely how he said, but it's something like, bring me the new body, a different name, but the same old body. Bring this new boy, because it's another killing of a Black child. at the hands of police violence. A refusal to be dismissed or rendered invisible. All of these things are so inspiring, but they also they do constitute a bit of a pitfall sometimes. I think that this can be a little bit of a moment of tension in the conversation, because the kind of staying woke culture and the call-out culture, all of those things in some ways are important, but also can sometimes mimic these structures of domination that created the situations that we now find ourselves in. So I think that this is a really dynamic moment of Black political protest, and it's also a really important opportunity for us to be reflective about some of those questions that were asked by people who were part of the Freedom Summer pedagogical model, which is, what do they have that we want? And what do we have that we want to keep? And what do they have that we don't want? And I think those are still really pertinent questions for today's movements.
I would just add one thing really quickly, is that part of what constitutes Black radicalism is not merely the sort of legible social movements that we see in our media, but also sort of subtle forms of infrapolitics. And so just to say bluntly, one of the pleasures of presenting this work in CARG is because of the ways that the scholars in that group are thinking about politics in the forms of graffiti, or politics and political speech and communication in forms of everyday life that may not be yet legible. They may not rise to the level yet of being organized social movements, but nonetheless demonstrate something about the ways that people continue to rebel, sometimes in the smallest acts of just experiencing joy amidst misery, or expressing oneself amidst oppression. So in that sense, a lot of the authors in the book are focused on things like the kinds of politics that come up through music, or the kinds of radical politics that emerge in visual culture that may not be legible yet as radical social movements, but nevertheless are part of a Black radical tradition. Marwan, you call on people.
No, Carolyn also has a question.
Okay, sorry.
I just wanted to mention it's very interesting that, Lubin, you asked that question, because you also quote Grace Lee Boggs in the introduction about what time it is in the world, and Lubin holds the Grace Lee Boggs chair. Oh, awesome. So it's a strange thing, as if you've had a conversation before coming, and I know you didn't. So I thought I would mention it.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I was wondering if maybe you can speak, maybe building a bit on your Alex, about like the space and place of the Black radical tradition, particularly in this period of gentrification and Black suburbanization. Can we think of do we sort of need the same sort of Black geographies in order to promote the Black radical tradition as we kind of understood it in the past?
I think you...
Question,
Yeah, I don't even know that I can as brilliantly express it as you just did. But it's about whether... I shouldn't just...
Here.
I'm sorry. Okay. Hi. Sorry, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about the space and place of the Black radical tradition, particularly in this era of suburbanization of Black people and Black families and gentrification and Black displacement. Do we sort of need the same Black geographies in the past to promote the same Black radical tradition?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that it would be wrong to think of the Black radical tradition in the sense of tradition that's fixed, that one always has to go back to some sort of source, right? I think that at least as Robinson wrote about it, in Black Marxism, he was thinking of a Black radical tradition as something that could be entirely Afrofuturist and not rooted to a political geography at all. That said, I think what you point to is the necessity of scholars of Black radicalism to always question issues of place and space, as you've said, of geography. So, for example, one of the reasons that I came into the orbit of Cedric Robinson is because through other kinds of writing, I was interested in how the Black radical tradition engaged with North Africa and the Middle East, which was an area that I thought had been sort of written out of Black Atlantic scholarship on radicalism. And I always return to Black Marxism because Robinson begins his historiography of Black radicalism in the Middle East, focusing on conflicts over slavery in the Mediterranean world, or what he might have referred to, although he didn't use these terms, as a Black Mediterranean world that had been completely subjugated or written out of what I had learned as a history of Black radicalism. And probably similarly, even in US-based histories or studies of Black studies, right, that are not necessarily internationalist because they're focused on urban geographies, I think it's extremely crucial to reimagine the spaces where Black protest takes place outside of just the urban city or outside of the inner city, and to think about absolutely what you just suggested, the new geographies where Black identity and racism take place. So I hope that gets at that. Do you want to add anything? Okay.
So I just want to thank you for such a thoughtful and thorough presentation, both of you. But I have a question about, I have a question about some of the logic of what you're talking about, and particularly from a historical perspective. So if we look at, racial capitalism is a huge formation. And if we look at the transformation, at big transformations that have taken place in history that we know about, for Protestantism to break the back of Catholic hegemony, it's an enormously violent movement. And we know that capitalism itself, historically, has been enormously violent. And you have talked about contemporary manifestations of that violence. And then in recalling the Black radical tradition, you've also talked about the violence of Haitian Revolution, of Denmark Vesey, and all of those folks, from 18 through the 19th century and so on. So I guess my question is a transformation of racial capitalism, so you have Gandhi, and it's pretty bad in India right now in terms of the position of the masses. And you have Martin Luther King, which is, of course, we think of as a great victory for nonviolence, but we still have all this incredible violence that manifests itself through gentrification and police killings and all the rest of it. So I'm asking you whether or not it's possible to conceive of a genuine transformation of racial capitalism without considerable amount of violence. And if one has to acknowledge that has to be part of the future, rather than to have a kind of sunny idea that what we just need is, and I'm not being disrespectful, more art, and gatherings and so on. But for honest to God transformation of this huge political formation, what is the prospect of doing it without violence? And I'm not advocating that we do it without violence or with violence. I'm asking what your analysis is.
I'll just start. There's so many. That's such a great question, and there's so much to say in dialogue with that. I think as much as we elevate the forms of resistance that have prized something different than the misogyny and racism and surveillance and police brutality and the violence of the racial regime, we also acknowledge that some of the most successful rebellions have been violent, and perhaps in future, some of the most successful ways of getting over this may in fact be through violence. I think that doesn't preclude actually a commitment to nonviolence, and it might sound strange to say that, but the principles of nonviolence are something to adhere to, I think, even if violence becomes necessary, because it is about something that we're not here just to tear a place down, we're here to build something up. And we're not about, this is from where I'm coming from anyway, I think Alex too, is that we're not about repeating a violent culture. We're not about repeating heteromasculinity in ways that are violent. Art can be extremely violent. The policing of art can be extremely violent. And the process of engaging in new representations can be a violent thing, sometimes overtly and explicitly and kind of bodily, corporally violent, but also it can be symbolically violent and can create effects that last for generations. And so I think there is also the fact that our embodied experiences in this world, especially people of color, women, are always about violence. They're always about mitigating violence, always. So we are always engaged in it if that is indeed something that people feel is necessary. We already have it without even asking for it. I don't think that's what you're saying.
Of course we have it, that's
Yeah,
it. And I
that's it.
forgot the Civil War, the most
Right.
violent transformation of all of slavery in the United States. But I'm asking, can it be done without adding to the violence?
Maybe not. It might not, but I also don't believe that we have, that is our only answer. I mean, I think this is the thing about the Black radical tradition and Black history in general, and things that we can learn from, not just Black people. I mean, I think the Black radical tradition, as Robinson deploys it, but also even as C.L.R. James talks about with the working class, it's not just Black people, not intended just for Black people, for all people, to learn from it in ways that demonstrate how a future can be discerned that does not have to be based on the violence that we've experienced. In fact, that freedom, yes, maybe that violence is a part of getting there, but certainly that a future does not have to be based on this. This is, and at the risk of rambling, I want to say though, this is one of the, I think, more instructive things about the 18th Brumaire that Marx writes. This is one place that I really give him credit, is this notion of making sure that we don't kind of reinvent ghosts from the past, that just as we're about to transform things, that unfortunately we come back and we rely on the same things because we've been so imbued in violence and in capitalism, we kind of build these things right back up, even as we have a revolutionary vision. It may not be that it's possible without violence, but I don't think that that's ever really been the point of the Black radical tradition, so much as it's been about an enduring belief, because people have no other choice, really, than to believe that things can change. Not only just because they don't have a choice, but because they've made it happen. They've seen it happen. They've created beauty even in the places that are the darkest and have the deepest amounts of despair, just put simply, anyway. And I know that it's hard for a lot of people right now to imagine that that's possible, but again, we're not about that life. I don't think we're about building something that's based in violence. I think we're about building something that's based in justice, and if that necessitates violence, I don't believe that ultimately that goes against the principles of nonviolence.
Just very briefly, I don't think the scale of Black radicalism, or the scale at which Black radicalism takes place, is at the scale of ending racial capitalism. Like, of course, that may be its goal, but actually the victory of the Black radical tradition is survival amidst racial capitalism, is finding ways to refuse the terms of racial capitalism that allow people to thrive and survive. So we need more art. But I think another sort of model to think about is what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now. There's a great book by Kali Okuno called Jackson Rising, about how a Black community has decided to self-organize itself outside of, as much as possible, the norms of state rule in order to form a new life. I mean, I think ultimately the kind of Black radicalism that Robinson was talking about are about the ways that not just Black diasporic people, but that communities self-organize outside of the norms and frameworks of racial capitalism as best they can to survive and thrive in other contexts. So, what smashes racial capitalism? I don't know the answer to that. And certainly, as you're right, revolutions have been violent. Civil rights movement was not just nonviolent, but was, of course, there were armed groups as well that played an important role in self-defense and in community defense as well.
On that note, I'm afraid we have to end. We're 15 minutes over time. Thank you so much for this. This shows how interesting.